Hello students, welcome to lecture 3.4, the rise of white supremacy and racial segregation. In this lecture we will discuss how the white supremacists came back to power in the South and other places in the United States. So we will review the different white supremacist groups during the Reconstruction. And we will focus on the most powerful among them, which was the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Next, we will talk about the black political power after Reconstruction, how African Americans were disfranchised. Toward the end of this lecture, we will discuss the terms of Jim Crow and Jim Crow laws. And we will finish with segregation and the notion of separate but equal. Right at the end of the Civil War and during the Reconstruction, several white supremacist groups sprang up everywhere in the country, and especially in the South. These white supremacist groups include the Knights of White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, the White Caps, and others. All of these groups were terrorist groups. They resorted to threat, intimidation, beatings, rapes, and murders to force black people into subordination. By far the most widespread and most powerful white organization was the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. This organization was created by a former Confederate general by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866. And the KKK transformed itself into a terrorist organization during the Reconstruction. Its main objective was to drive black people and their friend white Republicans from political power in the South. But Congress passed the Enforcement Act in 1871 to persecute the crimes of the KKK. So this led this organization to go underground. But in 1915, the organization reemerged with the movie The Birth of a Nation. Now, let's talk about the black political leaders and black power after the Reconstruction. As soon as the Reconstruction ended, black men, black political leaders in the South were forced out of office. The typical case was Richard H. Gleaves. This man was elected as a lieutenant governor of South Carolina in 1874, but by the end of the 1800s, he just ended up as a waiter in Washington, D.C. So black people in the South did not participate in politics anymore. So the political participation was limited since the end of Reconstruction. And most black people, most African Americans in the South as well as in the North could not challenge the white domination. So how did the white supremacists disfranchise and disempower black people in the South? Let's start with a definition here. So disfranchisement means the action of depriving the right to vote to someone. So after the Reconstruction, white Southern Democrats, so these are mostly the white supremacists, so they devised a variety of techniques to prevent black people from voting. So these techniques or tactics included literacy tests, so you have to know to read and write before you are allowed to vote. The poll tax, which means that you have to pay a tax to the state before you are allowed to vote. And the most important of these tactics was the grandfather clause, which means that if your father were not allowed to vote, then you are not allowed to vote yourself. But in addition to all of that, they intimidated and used violence against black people. So that's how they took away the votes of black people in the South. So let's take a look at some specific cases of disfranchisement. So the first case here is the case of Mississippi. So Mississippi, the state of Mississippi had a constitutional convention, so they had to rewrite their constitution in 1890. The state at that time established also voting requirements without violating the 15th Amendment. As you remember, the 15th Amendment was the constitutional amendment that gave the right to vote to black people, to black men. But even though the 15th Amendment was passed, the state of Mississippi was able to take away the vote of black men by using proof of residency, which means that you have to bring a proof of residency, even if you are living in the South and you don't have a proof of your residency, then you are not allowed to vote. And they require also the payment of taxes, so this is what is called poll tax, which includes that you should pay at least $2 in terms of tax before you are allowed to vote. And especially if you are being convicted, then you are not allowed to vote. So these are the tactics used in the state of Mississippi to disfranchise black men. In the case of South Carolina, the state had also its constitutional convention in 1895. So during that time, they also devised techniques to disfranchise black people. So they were mainly using this technique called understanding clause, which means that black people, black men especially, were not allowed to vote unless they were able to understand a document that were read to them as a test before casting their vote. Black people, black leaders in the state protested against this technique, but they were not able to defeat it. So the practice went on until the 1960s. Now, who was Jim Crow and what were these Jim Crow laws all about? Jim Crow was a comedian or a theater character, and the main thing that this character was doing was just to ridicule black people. But the character was transformed during the 1800s to mean racial discrimination and segregation. So there was a transformation of a term to become a meaning of racial discrimination and segregation. So the Jim Crow laws that were passed in the South, in most states in the South, were laws that enforce racial segregation. So that's the Jim Crow law. So these are laws separating people. So now let's talk about segregation and the notion of separate but equal. Segregation means separation of different races, and segregation also evolved slowly. The separation evolved slowly during the Reconstruction to become a white control and white domination. So instead of just being separated, black and white on different places, segregation became a domination by the white people. So black people had to accept this situation at the beginning. And the reason for this is that they thought that being separated was better than being excluded. So you may remember that in churches in the past and in different social organizations, there were different seats for the different races. So the situation was acceptable for black people because they thought that it was better to be admitted, to be included in churches than to be excluded. So that's about segregation and the separation. Segregation became the law of the land with a case of Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, Homer Plessy, who was an African-American man who could pass as a white man, he's actually really a light-skinned man. So Plessy challenged the state law of Louisiana on separation of races in the train. So the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court just upheld the state law on segregation. And this is how the notion of separate but equal became the law of the land, which means that the states and local governments have a right to separate black and white as long as the state and local government put in place the same facility. So it has to be equal. So that's the law. But as you can see, separation was never equality. And we will talk about that in Module 4. So we can see on this picture the notion of separate but equal at work. So in this picture, even the water fountains were separated everywhere in the country, especially in the south. So this young man was he's drinking at the drinking fountain for black or color people, and he was not allowed to drink the water from the fountain for white people. So this is the separation, separate but equal notion. So that concludes this lecture 3.4, how white people came back in power in the South and everywhere in the country. And that is also the end of Module 3. So please complete all of the assignments included in this module before moving to the next module, which is Module 4.